Gunfire shattered the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Plaza, raining glass onto New York's elite. While billionaires begged for their lives, the city's most ruthless crime syndicate boss stepped through the carnage only to drop his weapon and shield a terrified, trembling maid huddled in the shadows. Rain lashed against the towering windows of the Pierre Hotel, blurring the glittering skyline of Manhattan into a smear of neon and gold. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly opulent. The air was thick with the scent of roasted truffles' expensive Tom Ford cologne and the palpable arrogance of New York's untouchable elite. It was the annual charity gala for the Pendleton Foundation, a glittering front for Arthur Pendleton's money-laundering empire. Beatrice Gallagher stood near the towering double doors of the service kitchen, her hands clutching a silver tray, so tightly her knuckles were white. At 26, Beatrice was not the typical high society catering staff. Where the other servers were razor-thin, aspiring models with hollow cheekbones, Beatrice was soft and deeply curved, carrying weight that the unforgiving, starchy black and white uniform seemed determined to emphasize. The waistband dug painfully into her sides, a constant humiliating reminder that she didn't belong in this world of manufactured perfection. Gallagher, stop daydreaming and swap these glasses. The Bollinger, not the Moet, you imbecile, hissed Evelyn Rossi, the ruthless floor manager who treated the temp staff like indentured servants. Evelyn's perfectly manicured nails dug into Beatrice's upper arm, shoving her toward the VIP tables. Beatrice swallowed the lump of humiliation in her throat, keeping her eyes glued to the intricate marble floor. She needed this double shift. Her mother's medical bills from Mount Sinai Hospital were piling up on their tiny kitchen table in Queens, threatening to drown them. Pride was a luxury she simply could not afford. As she navigated the sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos, she remained invisible. To these people she was merely part of the furniture, a silent apparatus meant to dispense alcohol and clear away the remnants of their excess. She reached the main table where Arthur Pendleton sat holding court. He was a bloated, red-faced man who made his fortune displacing low-income families to build luxury condos. "I'm telling you, the Castiglione family is finished," Pendleton sneered, swirling his amber liquid. "Leo Castiglione might be a monster, but he's bleeding out from the docks dispute. Tonight is about securing our own futures." Beatrice's hands trembled slightly as she replaced the champagne flutes. The name Castiglione sent a chill down her spine. Even in her sheltered working-class life, she knew the whispers. Leo Castiglione was the undisputed head of the most vicious syndicate on the East Coast. He was a phantom, a man who dealt in shadows and violence, systematically tearing apart anyone who crossed his bloodline. "Careful, Arthur," murmured a pale, nervous city councilman sitting to his left. "Leo isn't a man you just write off. If he finds out you funded the hit on his brother, he won't—" Pendleton barked, though a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "Because by tomorrow morning, Leo Castiglione will be at the bottom of the Hudson." Beatrice stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't want to hear this. She didn't want to know the secrets of these terrifying men. She quickly pivoted, rushing back toward the safety of the service corridor. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind her, muting the string quartet playing a haunting rendition of Vivaldi. She leaned against the cool tile wall of the pantry, trying to catch her breath. The corset-like uniform was restricting her lungs. She reached up, attempting to loosen the stiff collar when the music abruptly stopped. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was a violent, jarring halt, followed by a sound that would haunt Beatrice's nightmares for years to come. Boom! The reinforced front doors of the grand ballroom didn't just open. They exploded inward, torn off their heavy brass hinges by a concussive blast. The shockwave rattled the plates in the pantry, sending a stack of bone china crashing to the floor around Beatrice's cheap orthopedic shoes. Screams erupted, raw, primal shrieks of terror that tore through the veneer of high society. The clatter of shattering crystal and overturning mahogany tables echoed like thunder. Beatrice cracked the service door open just a fraction, her breath catching in her throat. The glittering ballroom had descended into a war zone. Dozens of men in tailored, pitch-black suits had swarmed the room, moving with terrifying military-like precision. They held suppressed automatic weapons, their faces stony and devoid of mercy. The wealthy elites, the billionaires, the politicians, the untouchables were dropping to the floor, crawling over one another like rats, fleeing a sinking ship. Designer gowns tore on broken glass, diamond necklaces scattered across the blood-slicked marble. And then the sea of armed men parted. A man walked through the ruined doorway. He didn't rush. He didn't carry a weapon. He moved with the slow, predatory grace of a lion stepping into a cage of terrified sheep. He was breathtakingly tall, clad in a bespoke charcoal suit that clung to a brutally muscular frame. His face looked as though it had been carved from granite-sharp jaw, aristocratic nose, and eyes so dark they swallowed the light. It was Leo Castiglione. Arthur. Leo's voice was a low, gravelly baritone that somehow carried over the weeping and the chaos. It wasn't a shout. It was a death sentence. Pendleton was on his knees, his arrogant face drained of all color. He sobbed, crawling backward, until his back hit the edge of the stage. Leo, wait, I can explain. It was the councilman's idea. Leo didn't even look at the councilman. He simply snapped his fingers. Two of his men stepped forward, dragging Pendleton by the collar of his custom Armani tuxedo. Beatrice's legs gave out. She slumped back against the pantry shelves, her hands covering her mouth to muffle her own panicked gasps. She was trapped. There was no back exit from this specific pantry. It was a dead-end storage closet for dry goods and heavy silver chafing dishes. The scent of gunpowder and copper began to bleed under the door crack. She curled her chubby frame into the tightest ball she could manage, squeezing herself between a massive flour bin and a rack of heavy, folded tablecloths. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. Please let me be invisible. Just this once. Let me truly be invisible. The sounds from the ballroom were a symphony of calculated destruction. Leo Castiglione wasn't just killing his enemies. He was dismantling their sanctuary. The heavy thud of rifle butts, shattering the million-dollar ice sculptures, the ripping of silk drapery, the horrific wet crunch of violence, it all bled through the thin wooden door of the pantry. Beatrice clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her plump cheeks, smudging her cheap drugstore mascara. She was hyperventilating the tight uniform, restricting the oxygen her panicked brain desperately needed. "Clear the back rooms," a harsh voice barked from the ballroom. "Make sure none of Pendleton's rats scurried into the walls." Heavy footsteps approached the service corridor. The heavy swinging doors of the kitchen kicked open the hinges, screaming in protest. Beatrice stopped breathing entirely. Boots stomped across the tiled floor of the kitchen. Cabinets were ripped open, pots and pans crashing to the ground. They were getting closer. Suddenly the handle of her pantry door rattled. It was locked from the inside, a flimsy deadbolt she had flipped in a moment of pure instinct. Bang! A bullet tore through the wood, missing Beatrice's head by mere inches. Wood splinters rained down on her hair. She let out a tiny, involuntary whimper, a pathetic trapped sound that she instantly regretted. "Got one locked in here, boss." A rough voice called out. "Stand back. I'm blowing the hinges." "Wait." The command was quiet, but it carried an authority that froze the air itself. The rough voice instantly silenced. Slow, deliberate footsteps approached the splintered pantry door. Beatrice pressed her face into her knees, making herself as small as humanly possible behind the flour bin. She prepared for the end. She thought of her mother alone in that cramped apartment, waiting for a daughter who would never come home. Crack! A single devastating kick blew the door wide open. It slammed into the shelving unit, sending heavy cans of crushed tomatoes tumbling to the floor. The harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen flooded the dim pantry. A massive shadow fell over Beatrice. She didn't look up. She couldn't. She just trembled violently, a soft, helpless target in a torn apron waiting for the bullet. Leo Castiglione stood in the doorway. His dark, cold eyes swept the small room, expecting to find one of Pendleton's armed guards, or a cowardly politician clutching a briefcase of offshore accounts. Instead, he saw her. She was wedged in the corner, a curvy, terrified girl shaking so hard the rack above her was rattling. Her uniform was covered in flour and spilled champagne, and a jagged scratch ran down her plump cheek from a piece of flying wood. She was absolutely, undeniably innocent, a civilian trapped in a monster's crossfire. Leo's jaw tightened. In his world, innocence was a myth. People were either assets, liabilities, or targets. But looking at this sobbing, terrified woman, desperately trying to fold herself out of existence, a strange, foreign tightness gripped his chest. One of Leo's enforcers, a scarred brute, stepped up behind him, raising his weapon. "Want me to finish it, boss?" In a flash of movement so fast it defied his massive size, Leo turned and backhanded the enforcer across the face. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the kitchen as the man went sprawling into the stainless steel counters. "Lower your weapon before I take your hands." Leo snarled his voice, a lethal, vibrating threat. He turned his attention back to the corner. Slowly, Leo dropped to one knee, the expensive fabric of his suit pooling in the spilled flour and broken glass. He placed his weapon carefully on the ground, pushing it far out of reach. Beatrice peeked through her fingers, her breath catching. Up close, Leo Castiglione was terrifyingly beautiful. There was blood splattered across his crisp white collar, and his knuckles were bruised, but his eyes were entirely focused on her. The coldness momentarily replaced by something intensely observant. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Beatrice shook her head, terrified that making eye contact would seal her fate. "I said, look at me, Piccola." The Italian endearment slipped out unconsciously, a raspy whisper that made Beatrice's heart flutter in a way she couldn't understand. Slowly she lowered her hands. Her large, tear-filled hazel eyes met his dark, fathomless gaze. She expected to see cruelty. She expected to see death. Instead, he reached out. Beatrice flinched, shrinking back, but his hand didn't strike her. His large, calloused fingers gently brushed a piece of splintered wood out of her hair. His touch was shockingly warm, a stark contrast to the violence outside. "You're bleeding," he murmured, his thumb lightly grazing the scratch on her cheek. "Please," Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know anything. I just serve the drinks. My mum, she needs me. Please don't kill me." Leo's gaze dropped to her trembling lips, then to the tight, restrictive uniform that was digging into her soft waist. A flicker of deep, primal protectiveness flared in his chest, an instinct he hadn't felt in a decade. "No one is going to kill you," Leo said, his voice dropping an octave meant only for her ears. "Not tonight. Not ever." He stood up, shrugging off his heavy bespoke charcoal overcoat. With surprising gentleness, he leaned down and draped the massive coat over Beatrice's trembling shoulders. It swallowed her entirely, smelling of rich tobacco gunpowder, and him. It was a shield. His shield. "Stay wrapped in that," Leo instructed, his eyes locking onto hers. When my men escort you out the back, anyone who sees this coat will know that if they touch a single hair on your head, I will butcher their entire bloodline." Beatrice stared up at him, paralyzed by shock. The most dangerous man in New York had just destroyed a gala, executed his rivals. And yet he was looking at her, like she was the only precious thing left in a burning city. Leo turned his back on her, his demeanor instantly shifting back to the ruthless predator. "Clear a path to the service elevator," he roared to his men. "We have a VIP exiting." As the armed men scrambled to obey, Leo looked over his shoulder one last time. For a fraction of a second, the Mafia boss softened the corner of his mouth, turning up. "Go home to your mother, Beatrice," he said, reading her name tag. And as Beatrice clutched the lapels of the mob boss's coat, her heart racing wildly, she realized one terrifying truth: she had survived the night, but Leo Castiglione had just claimed her. The Q-train rattled along the elevated tracks of Astoria, Queens, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering as the subway car lurched forward. Beatrice sat rigidly in the plastic corner seat, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was still buried inside the heavy bespoke charcoal overcoat that smelled of gunpowder and expensive tobacco. The fabric was a fortress, dwarfing her curvy frame, but it was the only thing keeping her from shattering into a million pieces. Dawn was just beginning to break, painting the polluted New York skyline in bruised shades of purple and grey. True to his word, Leo Castiglione's men had escorted her out of the Pierre Hotel through a maze of service corridors. None of the heavily armed mobsters had dared to even make eye contact with her. The coat had acted as a talisman, a terrifying symbol of ownership that parted the criminal sea. When she finally reached her cramped third-floor walk-up apartment, the smell of stale radiator heat and cheap lavender soap grounded her. Her mother Abigail was asleep on the worn floral sofa, a thin knitted blanket pulled up to her frail chin. The television was murmuring a late-night infomercial, casting a blue glow over the endless stacks of medical bills on the coffee table. Abigail had stage 3 ovarian cancer. The experimental immunotherapy treatments at Mount Sinai Hospital were keeping her alive, but they were bankrupting them at a terrifying speed. Beatrice carefully slipped off the massive coat, hanging it in her small closet like a terrifying secret, and collapsed onto her own bed. She thought the nightmare was over. She thought she could just slip back into her invisible, struggling life. She was wrong. 2 days later, the reality of the Grand Plaza massacre dominated every news channel. The police called it a coordinated gangland strike. But the streets knew the truth. Leo Castiglione had eradicated Arthur Pendleton's entire syndicate in one night. However, in the chaotic underworld of New York, a power vacuum never stayed empty for long, and a wounded animal was always the most dangerous. Richard Croft Pendleton's ruthless and surviving underboss had managed to escape the ballroom before Leo's men sealed the exits. Croft was a desperate man, bleeding territory, and facing a mutiny from his own surviving soldiers. He needed leverage against the Castiglione family to broker a truce, and the underworld was whispering a bizarre rumor. The untouchable Leo Castiglione had spared a common maid, leaving his personal coat with her as a mark of protection. Beatrice knew nothing of the target painted on her back. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, she walked out of the sliding glass doors of Mount Sinai Hospital, her shoulders slumped. The financial counselor, a weary man named Mr. Harrison, had just informed her that Abigail's next round of Keytruda would be delayed unless they could provide a $10,000 deposit by Friday. As Beatrice navigated the desolate concrete labyrinth of the hospital's underground parking garage, her cheap sneakers squeaking on the damp pavement, a sleek black Lincoln Town car abruptly swerved around the corner. Its tires screeched as it cut off her path, the high beams blinding her. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. 4 doors flew open simultaneously. 3 massive men in cheap leather jackets stepped out their faces, twisted into ugly sneers. Well, well, the tallest one, a man with a jagged scar across his throat, smirked. You don't look like much of a mob boss's weakness. Sweetheart. A little heavy for Castiglione's usual taste, aren't you? Beatrice backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, her voice shaking. Please, I don't have any money. We don't want your money, pork chop. The scarred man laughed, pulling a heavy steel crowbar from his jacket. We just need you to come for a ride. Richard Croft wants to have a little chat with the girl who melted the Ice King's heart. They lunged for her. Beatrice screamed, spinning around to run toward the stairwell, but her heavy frame wasn't built for speed. A meaty hand closed around the collar of her thrift store sweater, yanking her backward so violently she stumbled and fell to the hard concrete, scraping her knees raw. "Shut up and get in the trunk," the man snarled, grabbing her hair. Before he could drag her another inch, the deafening roar of a high-powered engine echoed through the subterranean garage. A dark grey armoured SUV smashed into the side of the Lincoln Town car with the force of a freight train, showering the garage in shattered glass and twisting metal. The 3 thugs stumbled back in shock, reaching for their concealed firearms. The driver's side door of the SUV kicked open. Leo Castiglione stepped out. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit today. He wore a black tactical sweater that hugged his broad, muscular chest and dark cargo pants. He looked less like a Mafia boss and more like a special forces operator stepping onto a battlefield. He didn't speak a single word. He raised a suppressed tactical pistol and fired 3 times in rapid, terrifying succession. Pft. 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 The 3 men from the Lincoln dropped to the concrete, instantly neutralized, their weapons clattering uselessly away. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the hiss of steam escaping from the wrecked town car. Leo lowered the weapon and walked toward Beatrice, who was curled on the ground, weeping uncontrollably. The cold, lethal precision vanished from his eyes the moment he looked at her. He dropped to his knees, right there in the oil-stained puddle, completely uncaring about the grime ruining his clothes. Beatrice. His deep voice was a rumble of pure, unchecked anxiety. He reached out his massive hands, gently framing her tear-streaked face. Did they hurt you? Tell me where it hurts. They knew about the coat, she sobbed, trembling so violently she could barely form the words. They said I was your weakness. Leo's jaw clenched a muscle, feathering furiously in his cheek. He pulled her against his broad chest, wrapping his arms around her soft, shaking body, shielding her from the carnage of the garage. They were wrong, Leo whispered fiercely into her hair, his lips brushing against her temple. You are not my weakness, Piccola. You are the only innocent thing left in my world. And I will burn this entire city to ash before I let them touch you again. Come with me. Leo did not take Beatrice back to her apartment in Queens. Instead, the armored SUV drove deep into the night, leaving the suffocating skyline of Manhattan far behind. They arrived at a remote, highly fortified brutalist estate perched on the rocky cliffs of Montauk. The safe house was an architectural fortress of steel, poured concrete and reinforced glass that overlooked the violent, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Inside the house was stark, but undeniably luxurious, warmed by a massive stone fireplace. Beatrice stood awkwardly in the center of the living room, clutching her bruised arms. She felt entirely out of place in this millionaire's stronghold, her thrift store clothes and scraped knees a stark contrast to the imported Italian leather furniture. Leo emerged from the hallway, having discarded his tactical gear for a simple white undershirt and dark sweatpants. He carried a first aid kit. He guided her to the sofa with surprising gentleness, kneeling before her to clean the scrapes on her knees. "Why are you doing this?" Beatrice finally whispered the silence of the large house, pressing in on her. "I'm nobody. I'm just a maid. I'm not the kind of woman men like you fight for." She gestured self-consciously to her soft, heavy waistline, deeply ashamed of her lack of perfection. Leo paused, the antiseptic wipe hovering over her skin. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a burning, terrifying intensity. "The women in my world are hollow," Leo said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "They are sharp edges and calculated lies built to survive monsters. You are soft. You are real. When I looked at you in that pantry, terrified and bleeding, you were the first genuine thing I had seen in a decade. You are beautiful, Beatrice. Every single curve, every soft edge. You hide yourself away, but to me, you are a masterpiece." Beatrice's breath hitched. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever looked at her heavy frame and seen something to worship. When his large, warm hand trailed up from her knee to gently rest on her thigh, a jolt of electricity shot straight to her core. For the next 2 weeks, the Montauk fortress became a strange, beautiful sanctuary. The outside world raged, the news reported a bloodbath as the Castiglione syndicate systematically hunted down Richard Croft's remaining loyalists. But inside those concrete walls there was only peace. Leo treated Beatrice not as a captive, but as a queen. He cooked for her, pulling on his Sicilian roots to make rich, decadent pasta dishes that he insisted she eat, kissing her deeply whenever she tried to count calories. He mapped the soft curves of her body with a reverence that healed years of her deep-seated insecurities. But the darkness of his reality could not be held at bay forever. On a stormy Friday night, the estate's perimeter alarms shrieked, slicing through the quiet romance. Richard Croft had made his final suicidal play. Desperate and out of options, he had assembled a strike team of heavily armed mercenaries to storm the Montauk cliffside, hoping to catch the Mafia boss off guard. Leo moved with terrifying speed. He shoved Beatrice into the estate's reinforced panic room behind the library's bookshelves. "Do not come out until I open this door," he commanded, his eyes completely black with murderous intent. He pressed a hard, bruising kiss to her lips. "I am coming back to you, I swear it." The heavy steel door locked. For 20 agonizing minutes, Beatrice sat in the dark, listening to the muffled, horrific sounds of a tactical siege. Gunfire rattled the foundations. Explosions shook the floorboards. She prayed desperately, clutching the heavy charcoal coat that Leo had draped over her shoulders before locking her in. Then the gunfire stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the explosions. Beatrice held her breath, tears streaming down her face, waiting for the heavy footsteps of Richard Croft's men. The mechanical lock of the panic room clicked. The heavy door swung open. Leo stood there. He was covered in blood, breathing heavily, his white shirt torn. But he was alive. Behind him, the immaculate living room was a war zone, but the estate was secure. Croft was dead. The war was finally over. Leo dropped his weapon and fell to his knees in front of her, resting his forehead against her soft stomach, his broad shoulders trembling with an adrenaline crash. Beatrice immediately ran her hands through his dark hair, holding the monster who had become her savior. "It's over," he breathed roughly, looking up at her. "They will never hunt you again." The next morning, as the sun rose over the Atlantic, Leo handed Beatrice a sleek black folder. Inside was paperwork from Mount Sinai Hospital. Her mother's medical bills were completely paid off. An anonymous donation of $500,000 had been credited to Abigail's account. "You are free," Leo said, his voice uncharacteristically thick with emotion. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the ocean, unable to look at her. "I will have my men drive you back to Queens. You can go back to your life. You never have to see my darkness again." Beatrice looked at the paperwork, then at the broad, scarred back of the most dangerous man in New York. He was offering her an out, knowing his world was entirely soaked in blood. But as she stood up, the heavy charcoal coat falling off her shoulders, she knew she could never go back to being invisible. She walked up behind him, wrapping her soft arms around his muscular waist, pressing her cheek against his back. "I don't want to be free of you," Beatrice whispered, her voice steady and resolute. "I want to stay right here in the shadows with you." Leo turned his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and overwhelming devotion. He pulled her flush against his chest, capturing her lips in a fierce, possessive kiss that sealed their fate. The Mafia boss had destroyed a Gala, but in the ruins of his violent world, he had found his soft, perfect queen. If this gripping story of survival, intense Mafia romance, and finding love in the darkest of places kept you on the edge of your seat, we need your support. Please like this video to help us bring more thrilling stories to life. Share it with your friends who love an unforgettable alpha protector and a curvy heroine who defies the odds. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next heart-pounding drama.